Hi, I'm Kat.
I'm Arden 13.
Welcome to our show, World Tiger.
Building Dragon.
Today we are continuing our series on some world building basics.
Last week we talked about the big why question when it comes to world building and a little bit about where's to start. This week we're talking about the huge questions when it comes to world building. The what's, the when's, the who's, and the how's.
There is a lot to discuss, so let's get started.
Let's do this. So, we have some questions, and really it should be stated that world building in general is easiest to tackle when you are answering questions. You are asking yourself a question and giving yourself an answer to that very question in the context of your world. So we're going to start out with the first few questions that start with the word what. First and foremost, and this is often something that takes the longest?
It can take a while.
It can take a while, especially when you try to find, like, just the perfect word. What is the name of your world? Now, that is varied and differed, obviously, for everything, for everyone, and everyone has their own way of arriving to that name. Some people use fantasy name generators.
Which is a fantastic tool for naming everything. I can spend hours and hours and hours on fantasy name generator. Just throwing that out there.
Anything and everything.
Anything and everything.
They are constantly updating. Fantasy Name Generator is a godsend, to be frankly honest. But where Fantasy Name Generator falls a little bit short, and I have to hand it to such individuals as Tolkien and George R.R. Martin for this, is when it comes to naming conventions. And where that falls short for Fantasy Name Generator is that you kind of have to figure it out yourself and kind of weave some things together, whereas if you were to take pre-existing word stems, that can kind of fit a little bit better and make a little bit more sense than just like randomly generating names. But again, there's nothing wrong with that. We both spent hours on Fantasy Name Generator.
Way too long.
Not way too long. It's great. It's perfectly helpful. Names that come to mind, Middle-earth is the big one that comes to mind for me. For Middle-earth, we understand that when Tolkien was naming his world, he took a lot of inspiration from Norse mythology. Right. Which, according to Norse mythology, Earth is referred to as Midgard. Literally Middle-earth. Right.
He was just looking for a word that kind of symbolized that, like, it's not heaven and it's not hell, it's just that middle ground where dwarves and elves and humans can all exist. And so I remember I did a little bit of research on that. He had some other names on there, which would be Great Lands, Outer Lands, Hitherlands. All are really great options as well. And I think that's something useful to note as well, is when you're naming your world, don't get super caught up on it. Like, if you have a couple ideas, just start throwing them out there. Don't let the name of your world stop you from progressing. I think once he settled on Middle-earth, that's what he used from there on out, but there's still writings of his where he didn't go back and write in Middle-earth. He still kept the Great Lands and Outer Lands within some of his notes, which is why that's what it could have been called.
And also trying to take inspiration, again, not necessarily from things that taking inspiration from things that already exist. Literally, Earth is called Earth because the Latin word for Earth.
Right.
Which is Terra, and there are a number, I do believe StarCraft refers to humans as Terrans. They are literally just people of Earth, people of the Earth, which is totally fine and makes complete and total sense. It's simplistic, absolutely, but it makes sense.
It makes sense. Oh, another tool for naming things is Google Translate. You just go into Google Translate, type in a word that you want. I typed in theater, and I was like, scroll down, Latin, theatrum, done. Easy peasy. Done. It was the simplest,
I love Latin.
Here we are.
I love Latin. I took 8 years of it in school.
Cool.
In cool. Yeah. No, I love Latin, and so when you told me that your world's name was Theatrum, I was like, oh, Latin!
Yeah.
That was just me. Elicrid came about, sometimes I just take words and word stems and throw them together, even if they do not mean what I want them to mean. But I kind of went a little bit of the route of Tolkien, and I wasn't creating my own language, but I made reference to a pseudo-language that I had created, and Elecrid means born of shards, to represent what Elecrid is, and it is literally a world born of shards, is where I got that inspiration. For my setting of Nora, my world Nora, I called it Nora because A, I like the name Nora, and B, it just kind of felt natural.
It does feel right, because Nora, the world, is just very... It's plagued by demons. It's almost got... I don't want to call it hollow, but it's kind of got that, like, sunken in, like...
It's very introverted. It's a very introverted world. And to me, Nora is kind of like an introverted name in a way.
Right.
It's nothing spectacular. It's nothing grandeur. It's simple. It's Nora.
So, what is the name of your world? I mean, really, it could mean something, or it doesn't have to mean something. It doesn't have to have a root
Not at all.
name. It could just be, maybe you make up your own language, or it's just like, this word's really cool and it sounds good. Yeah. Another what question that's really important to ask yourself when you start world building is, what does your world look like? Now, we do plan to do an episode all about map making in general, just
We're gonna have a friend come in with help
right.
us.
How do you just start with a blank piece of paper and then build out these crazy, incredible maps? But there are a couple tools that are out there that can definitely help you.
But there is nothing wrong. When I was very young, and they would ask me what you wanted to be when you grew up, I would say I wanted to be a cartographer. I love map making, and I love just sitting down with a pencil and paper and just drawing a map. There is nothing wrong with drawing maps. That's what Tolkien did. That's what Martin did. That's what so many people have done. Paolini drew his inspiration from Narnia and Middle-earth. C.S. Lewis drew his. All of these great authors and setting creators have drawn their maps. And that's basically where I started, was I drew out Elecrid, I've drawn out Nora, I've drawn out Hiatus. And Nora's had 6 different maps. It has changed, but I lost one, and so I drew a different one, and then I lost that one, then I drew a different one, but then I found the first one, and it was a struggle.
What I did was I started off with the main continent of Theatrum, and I printed that off, because I had the outline on just a piece of printer paper, and then I went in with a pencil and was able to draw in the where the countries would be. I was able to draw in the mountains and everything like that, where I wanted it, and add in my own little notes on paper, because technology is great, and I do like making notes on the computer, on the iPad, but there's just something about sitting there with a map in front of you and being able to draw and write your own notes and get everything visually with just a pencil and paper.
Absolutely.
The other point that we have is talking about verbal references. So not everything, you don't have to start just creating a map. You can start with more of an idea or just a sentence.
A quote. So many different things that, as we are working our way through kind of coming up with the idea of our world, maybe it's not a world that requires a map. Maybe there is no map. I'm looking at worlds like Lothric and the world for Bloodborne in the Dark Souls series, in the Souls series. We've never seen, there's no illustrated full-blown map of those locations, but it is all based on the idea, the quote, the way that things have been formed is based on the progression of time, but it's more or less a spoken world building rather than a visual world building. And that in and of itself has a lot of really cool things. So you don't necessarily have to have a drawn map, but you can have an idea about what the world kind of looks like or what it emulates. A favorite RPG system that we are currently looking at, called Degenesis, describes the world. They do have a map, but it describes the world as a ruined Garden of Eden. And when you say that, and that is the visual that people have in their heads, that could almost be enough.
Right, and it tells you pretty much exactly what you need to know about the world that you're stepping into.
Absolutely. I was thinking about, I just recalled the Maze Runner series, and they don't specifically have a map. It is taking place in our world on Earth,
right?
And things have definitely changed, but they more or less, they rely on their world building and the way that we can visualize the world as being scorched.
Right.
And that already, Mad Max does the same thing. It's the idea of this world being scorched. We burned the world, or whatever. And that already puts in our heads what the world kind of looks like and what we're dealing with.
And I think, especially now that you mention it with the Maze Runner series, the reason why there's not... I think one of the big reasons why there isn't a map of the world, or we don't really get to see the full world, is because we're seeing it through the eyes of these children, and they don't know what the outside world looks like. All they know, at least in the first book, is this maze.
That's the maze.
And so,
and they barely have that
and they don't
map
right
out.
they don't and so it's one of those, like, they don't need a map. That's another instance where you really don't need a map. You just need enough verbal references.
Do you have anything else for verbal references?
No, I think that was pretty much it. I know for my own, a lot of the time I'll have a map and a verbal reference just to kind of give both versions, especially if I just have like a lighter map and a more detailed quote. I think that works really well, just personally for me.
It can, your world building, your references for the way that the world looks can be as little as a sentence to as large as the map itself.
And the map doesn't have to be a full world map either. I think when thinking about A Song of Ice and Fire, most of the time, as far as our world map, you're getting one continent.
And that's actually a good lead in to our next conversation, is what is known about the world. And I actually had this conversation with Logan not too long ago, where we have a lot of fantasy worlds whose maps aren't fully realized. I'm thinking of Middle-earth, the world of Ice and Fire, the continent from the Witcher series, Narnia. I can never remember the name of the Inheritance Cycle world. I can never remember.
Because they don't mention it a lot. It's just...
Yeah, it's not really relevant.
Right.
Because it's all about the dragons. But those worlds, those maps, when we look at those maps, when we look at those worlds, they're not fully realized. There's parts of the world that we don't know, and the most notable to me would be the world of Ice and Fire. We have references, verbal references to the continent of Sothorios. We have nothing about anything like south of what we get in the map. There's like the peninsula of the continent of Uthos, so we know that there's another continent out there, but we have no idea what is out there because all our focus is on is Westeros and Essos, and that's where history is recorded.
And I think that's really important, especially kind of talking about what we talked about last time, was just if you're writing a book or you're writing a story, you really only need to focus on what your characters are experiencing right now. You know, those other continents don't really play a huge role in A Song of Ice and Fire, unfortunately. You know, when we're talking about Lord of the Rings, you only really need to focus on Middle-earth, because that's where all the conflict is happening. That is where our main focus is. Would be really interesting to figure out what else is out there in the world of Middle-earth.
There is a fully realized map of Middle-earth, like, floating around out there, but really, the section that we care about is, like, maybe 30% of the world.
I think that when we're talking about what is known within your world, and when you're asking yourself what is known within your world, that also gives you a good chance to kind of give your mind a break. You know, if you know, like, this is all that this portion of my world, like if you're only wanting to focus on a continent for the moment, or maybe if you want to start even smaller and just start with an island, what is known to that island may be very different from what a larger continent may know within your world. But if you just start with, like, what does this little island, what is known to them, being able to build within that, and then eventually branching out, I think
as the focus point of your storytelling.
I think that really will help in general, just that way you're not starting with, like, here is this entire world and everything that's known within it. If you just start with, like, a small spot and then move out, it's a little bit easier.
Going back to the reference of the world of Ice and Fire, the reason why we only know what we know about, like, Westeros is fully realized, Essos is for the most part fully realized, is because our focus on the story is from Westeros. And the people that have come from Valyria into Westeros, like, that is the focus of the story, so we don't know anything that's beyond that, because those people who have recorded the history that we are reading about haven't gone there. They haven't figured out what's out there. So Martin doesn't have to figure out what's out there. He just has to make like, oh yeah, you know, one guy came there one time and realized that there were giant gorillas and acid-spitting basilisks and decided that he didn't want to deal with it, so he left. And that's all we know. And that's all we know. And that's totally fine. Those make really incredible worlds. Really interesting
And I think it just makes it more interesting, and it gives more life to your world if there are mysteries and unknowns to your world, because even in our world today, we don't know absolutely everything going on in our world, and to say that there might be someone in your world that knows absolutely everything, I don't know.
But at the same time, there are people that know literally nothing. Like the original maps of Earth, when explorers came to the New World, are completely...
I think they're funny. They're so
hilarious.
Funny.
They're hysterical how wrong they are. But that's fine. And at the same time, if you're trying to create a world that is fully realized, mentions that come to my head are like Neverland from Peter Pan, the world of Avatar: The Last Airbender, as well as Azeroth from the World of Warcraft series. Azeroth is kind of a weird gray area, but we'll get to that here in a second. There's nothing wrong with that at all. The world of Avatar: The Last Airbender is so fleshed out, the thing that they do very well is that you're dealing with four groups of people, four like distinct groups of people, and in and amongst them there may be some slight variations, some different cultural shifts here and there, but for the most part you're dealing with four collective groups of people. That makes it very easy to get through, and you have like your traditions, your tropes that you're drawing from, and that's super cool. Why Azeroth is kind of a gray area is because it's primarily a video game setting, so if they decide that they wanted to throw something else in there, like, oh, I don't know, an island full of kung fu pandas, they can just say, oh, they couldn't see that initially because there was some mists around it or whatever. I'm not bitter.
Yeah, I think another point, kind of drawing from the what is known within your world, kind of going into what defines your world. What makes your world
unique,
special? Right. Do you have dragon riders? Do you have, is there one incredible ring that rules them all? Is there a sports event every single year that gathers 24 kids and throws them in all together and people watch it on TV? What is...
Because what those establish is kind of a precedence for what defines your world, and it answers the question, what do you intend to accomplish? Christopher Paolini created his world specifically because he had the idea, he thought the coolest thing when he was younger was riding a dragon. Obviously he's never done that, but he thought, how cool would that be? So his entire world was centered around the dragon riders. For Tolkien, his world was created because he created these languages, but the whole narrative that the most common narrative that we've come to understand was surrounding this one ring. And that's what defines it. That's when you think Middle-earth, that's what you think about. When you think of Aragon, that's what you think about. When you think of the Hunger Games, you think about 24 kids murdering each other. That's just the thing. And that's totally fine. Because it can be as broad as something that encompasses the entire world, like Dragon Riders, something that encompasses a majority of the world and a majority of its history, like the One Ring, or it can be one country with the Hunger Games. That's what distinctifies your world. That's what makes it unique to you and to everyone else, and that's pretty much helps to answer the question of what do you hope to accomplish.
And the really cool thing about what defines your world is this can kind of be optional. You don't have to have something that makes your world super duper different. It is nice to have. It's nice to have something to be like
a focus.
Right? Like, how is the rest of this world, how is my world affected in this part by the Dragon Riders? Or do they know about the Dragon Riders? It's just something to connect everything together, but you don't necessarily need it.
It goes back to the idea of start small, build out. The small idea is the dragon riders. Building out is how the world is affected by that. That small idea is the ring.
Mm-hmm.
Building out is how the world is affected by it. That small idea is that there are 4 nations that each have their own bending ability, control over an element. How is the world affected?
Mm-hmm.
Kat, before we moved on, I wanted to ask you, kind of going back with these whats, but what really defines Theatrum for you? What makes your world unique?
The idea of this pantheon of gods that used to be so prevalent and so a part of this world's everyday processes and how it existed, that have now gone. They've receded since the Old Age. So just that vacancy of like, there's something missing. There was something great here before, but now it's gone. What happened? And just that idea of, what once was has now kind of closed its doors and gone into hiding.
Sure.
What about Ellicrid? What defines it?
What defines Ellicrid for me is the deeper mysteries, the ever foreboding the ever foreboding unknown.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to the way that countries interact with each other, I love civilization games. I love like war games and like how people interact. That's something that I'm always really interested in seeing how these cultures have communicated and what their relationships are like. But at the same time, that is all underlying a true kind of mystery as to what really is the truth and what really is happening in the world. What are the deeper machinations? What's the deep magics and stuff like that?
How and why are these things, and what were they before?
Yes. So in a way, I think you and I have a very similar idea, where yours is a vacancy, and is an understanding that there is a feeling of something is missing, whereas in Ellicrid,
there's a lot going on here.
There's something here, and we don't know what it is. It's the fact that I would argue, in Theatrum, it was known that something existed. In Ellicrid, it is unknown. And there's that duality, which I really like, between the two worlds. That's it.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the when. Time period is very important. It's important because it helps to give an idea and a sense of, like, technologically where we are in the world. And the way that I've kind of had things broken down here is that we have the classical age, which is more or less your, like, Greco-Roman ancient world. Your... How do I distinctify this?
Medieval period.
Your medieval period.
So kind of like knights and kings and lordships,
feudal systems, and so on and so forth. Then we have kind of like the industrial age. Yes, the industrial age, which is where we get into more of your like steampunky kind of stuff, but also the pushing the boundaries of coming out of like that very stereotypical medieval style into more of a modern innovation, the age of innovation.
Right.
Next we have the modern era. Basically, not necessarily the age of technology, but the age of... Yeah, I guess the age of technology makes the most sense.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, there it is. And then we have like the futuristic age, the postmodern age, the future, what the future looks like with your robots, your cyborgs, and
it could be space travel if
could
that's
be
what
space
your world
travel
goes into, and yeah.
And the reason why we bring up these those are generalities, because obviously no two worlds are really alike in terms of the way that their history goes. One world could have taken thousands of years to get to the classical age, and that's totally fine. The main focus of what you wanted to do was maybe in the primal age, or it was just for a very long time this world was dark and never had any order or civility. That's fine.
I think another point to add in here, taking a book out of Ellicrid, is that there could be times where you do get almost up to a modern age, and then something happens that bumps you all the way back down to the medieval period, or even a classical period, where something happens within your world that takes away that technology, or that innovation, and now you're back to maybe not square one, but you're back to your kings, your knights, your swords, your
scraping by with what you can,
right,
to figure out some semblance of order and civilization. And that's great. Those post-apocalyptic kind of feels, that's always really fun, and I don't know why we've never mentioned that up until this point. Love post-apocalyptic.
Yes.
But time period also helps for you to establish, if you're doing like a fantasy genre, fantasy doesn't mean specifically it's going to be set in a medieval style period. It could be a fantasy setting
in the modern day.
It could be a fantasy setting in the future. That would necessarily kind of cross genres a little bit, but there's nothing wrong with that. What if it was sci-fi in the medieval period? What does that look like? Your time period is completely up to you about your current era, because then you get to work your way backwards, which is A, a lot of fun, and B, one of the easiest ways to get overwhelmed. So try your best to just take a breath and start with the main points in history. Some people think, or are gluttons for punishment, like me, and think we need to detail out the entire history. You don't have to do that.
You really don't.
You can just focus on the main points in history that change the world.
Here's something that I like about recorded history, going off on a slight tangent, is that most of the time when you're writing down a recorded history, it's being written from the point of view of the people that maybe won. Most of the time that they won. So you can have almost like glutton for punishment here. If you like to write, you can have your, like, as a world builder, you have, this is what people think happened, and this is what's being written down in their storybooks, and this is how it's told to their children, but this is what really happened. And, you know, right. And for me, I know for kind of going through with taking inspiration and how I wrote Theatrum is that you have this worldwide event where there was this great flood. No one really knows what happened before that. It's not really a recorded history. People know that it kind of happened, and that kind of solves the question for me, is like, well, how old is Theatrum, and what year are we in Theatrum? And it's like, I don't even know.
We are 400 years after the flood.
Right, and that's pretty much all I need to say, or all I need to write about.
And it separates the current era because of this moment, and you articulated it a lot better than I could. What I was trying to communicate was the fact that so much happened in the classical age, Rome, Greece, everything that happened with the dynasties in China, the Three Kingdoms, and everything that happened in India. Just so many different things were going on, but there was a dramatic shift in the world at the Renaissance.
Right.
There was a dramatic shift in the world, according to Christianity, when Christ was born. And we count our years in that way. So for your modern era, for Theatrum, it's so many years after the flood.
Right.
And then we know that there was this history that happened way long ago, but we don't need to talk about that.
Because it doesn't
necessarily matter, and it can be amorphous. The same way in a Song of A World of Ice and Fire, it's the years are recorded before the conquest and after the conquest.
Right.
And that's super helpful. That's super nice. For Ellicrid, it's 5 ages.
Yeah, yes.
Varying length and happenings.
There's a lot going on in Ellicrid at all times. I think another interesting point, even more questions about when and why, is, let's say that there isn't a worldwide calendar. There isn't a universal calendar that everybody uses. Everybody's going to have a different year, like how many years. Everyone's going to have different months. Everyone's going to measure time differently. Everyone's going to... It's a lot. So it depends on how crazy you want to make it or how simplistic you want to make it.
Because you can make it as easy as they have the same measure of time, day, month, and years as Earth. And that's fine. That's just standard. That's easy.
Change the month names.
Or you can make it so the idea of the universal calendar has haunted my dreams.
Yes.
It's haunted my dreams.
Is there one? I don't know. But anyway, as far as general world building, answering the questions of when really helps you flesh out and get you started where it's like, okay, currently my world is in the medieval period. We've got kings and knights and lords going around. How did we get from this classical period, the ages of myths, to this point? That gives me plenty of room to work with to add in, my own stories, my own histories, my own myths.
How did we get here and how long has that been?
Right. And then and after, let's say there's no such thing as finishing in world building, but let's say I'm satisfied with what I've built out from the classical period and the medieval period. Now I can go, where do they go from here? And you just add in that industrial period to your world, you just move forward.
Move forward, easy peasy.
Mm-hmm.
Time is a construct, and it is how you choose to convey your time that will help to stratify and create an understanding for your players, for your readers, for whomever, of what they are dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
It is just a very helpful thing that I have found to figure out what time period you are more or less setting the world, so you can either work backwards or work forwards.
Mm-hmm. I think just answering the question of when is an easy way to get you started with world building, but it can also be one of the easiest ways to overwhelm yourself. So start small, figure out where you're at, and just kind of hang out there for a little bit before you move forward or backwards. Or forward or backwards.
I think one of the easiest places to start when it comes to time period is kind of going off of, I'm not saying that this list is set in stone and perfect, but like, are we in the classical era? Are we in innovative era? Are we in the future? Like, start there and then you can go from there. Now we need to talk about the who's of world building. Who populates your world?
There could be anything from a difference of races, ethnicities, cultures, just who are you interacting with? What are they like? What are their moral codes and all that fun stuff?
At the base level, this can be incredibly simplistic, and the most simplistic way of going about it is if you are creating a fantasy setting of any kind, you can literally just say that it is populated by elves, dwarves, humans, and orcs. Very simple, very straightforward. Where we start to get into the initial complexities of that is when you start to say that these 4 different races have different variations therein.
So you've got, for maybe just elves, you could have sun elves, you could have moon elves, you could have the drow. For humans, it could be a huge variety of different types of humans. And then that's just starting with the races. Then you get into their different cultures and maybe even their different languages, what they believe, how they run their Societies
are different and differ depending on where they are in the world. And so you could have a coastal society is incredibly different than one that's more inland. But with who's, it also comes down to not just who populates your world, but how do those cultures interact with each other. In most fantasy settings, there is a conflict between the elves and the dwarves, but we have to ask the question of why. And a lot of people just assume that when you say that there are elves and dwarves in the world, they don't interact well with each other, but it really comes down to the why that is a thing. And it's the same way with the way that orcs and humans interact with each other. Generally not a very symbiotic relationship, whereas you see humans interacting with elves kind of like a parent interacting with a child. And then dwarves don't care about anything, just like, leave me alone, I'm gonna do my own thing. And those are tropes that have been passed down, so we as human beings, we as people in our society understand and know what to expect when we read those things. But when it comes to your individual world building, it's up to you to make those distinctions.
I think another really important thing when you're talking about world building for your world is, instead of getting overwhelmed with the idea of, there are elves and dwarves and humans and how are they all interacting, is figuring out what is important versus unimportant in your world. And that could be something as simple as, you know what, in my world, there's not going to be elves. It's just going to be dwarves and humans. Simplify it out. Or maybe they are still there, but they're unimportant because they stay in the mountains, or however you want to play it. So knowing who is important versus unimportant in your world can play a huge part in your world building.
I could also make a reference to the Elder Scrolls series, where there are no dwarves left in Tamriel. We just have the remnants of their kingdoms, and we have like all the clockwork soldiers and things, which is in and of itself interesting world building, but it also kind of shifts a level of importance away from the dwarves, where we understand that they existed and they were a thing, but now we get to focus more on what is actually relevant, and that is a choice also that you can make. I want to say something about sci-fi, because we have been making a lot of allusions to fantasy. Kat and I are fantasy writers moreover than we are anything else, so we kind of, I have to consciously think about like sci-fi, what I want to do when it comes to sci-fi. Sci-fi is ostensibly the same way, but I would argue that it can be a little bit more broad in terms of when you look at it, when you're initially looking at it. But at the same time, at the base level of things, you're just kind of switching up the names a little bit. Like if there's two groups of people, one of them is like high, powerful, lofty, they've been around for a really long time, maybe they're a very long-lived empire, and then there's a more reclusive group of people that like is more in tune with like the earth and crafting and have more like innovative skills, whereas this more long-lived group of aliens or extraterrestrials have more of a like are more in touch with the cosmic powers at being. You're just writing about dwarves and elves, but they're in space now, and that's fine. But I also think sci-fi, what people think is that sci-fi is the only genre in which, when it comes to world building of who, you can really explore the differences between these creatures, whereas I would argue you can probably do the same thing with fantasy. You just have to get a little bit more creative, because it turns from sci-fi jargon to magic mumbo jumbo. But I do agree with you that when it comes to trying to figure out, stratify where you want to start when it comes to world building,
figuring out what's important,
and then just be broad about it at first. If you're broad about it, and then you can kind of start to like wiggle your way to like the specificities, that's honestly can be the easiest.
When you were first writing XIII, what was the race or group of people that you focused on the most when you started world building?
Dragons.
Yeah.
Dragons. So many dragons, and not just like, I'm not talking about big like fire-breathing dragons that will raise your town to the ground. It's more or less, I started with the dragon kin and the way that the entire dragon kind of revolved around themselves. In XIII, there is the understanding of mankind, but really when you look at Earth, we talk about mankind as the dominant species or whatever. In XIII, it's dragonkind. They are the dominant species, and so I spent a lot of time figuring out the breakdown of like who they were as a people
and how they operated and
how they broke down. You with the XIII?
I
have an idea.
Yeah, I really started with I started with the country of Sun Domino, and I guess that would be considered a culture. I think I consider it more of a culture, just in how they operated and how their great influence on Theatrum as a whole, as they sought out knowledge and looked to retain that knowledge, and
Lastly, talking about the hows. We've kind of talked about the hows in terms of going through with all these questions. Basically, these questions build upon each other very easily, but more or less we're covering, how do I begin, and then how do I know that my world is ready? Are the two major how questions when it comes to world building. So how do we begin, Kat?
I would say draw on your interests. Find something that you are really inspired by, or something that really interests you, and start there. Like we said in our last episode, it's pretty smart to start small and then branch out. Starting with something that you enjoy, whether that be a small town or maybe a race of people that you want to build out. Maybe that you could start with the who's of start with your dwarves. Maybe you're a huge fan of dwarves. Start off with how they operate and what that looks like, and then branch out to, well, how do they relate to the elves or the humans or the orcs? How do they interact, and build that world out from that way.
Find one of these questions and start there.
Mm-hmm.
Start with the who's, start with the when's, start with the what does the name of my world, what does my world look like. Start with one of those things. And then from there you can start to build out.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, you know, you may at this moment in time be really interested in the dwarves and really like dwarves, and so you build out and flesh out this plethora of dwarven culture. But then by, 2 years down the road, when you've continued to build, the dwarves have remained more or less the same. You may have tweaked some things here and there, but all of a sudden you're on this drow elf kick.
Right.
And it's just...
You can hop around. You can world hop a little bit. And I think, how do you know when your world is ready is an interesting question, because I guess it kind of depends on what you want to do accomplish with your world.
You have to answer the question, what do you intend to accomplish with this world?
Mm-hmm.
And that can be more expansive than just, I want this to be an RPG setting, or I want this to be the setting of a book. It can be something more expansive, but you have to be able to answer that question, I think.
Right.
When you sit down at the end of, this long stretch of world building, and you're able to look at it and go, this isn't complete, but it is finished to the point where I am satisfied and I have answered this question, I can do something with this, then you're ready.
Yeah. I know for Theatrum, I started off with the very basics of the continent. I knew what I kind of liked, and I knew where I wanted to start people off, and I ran a 4 or 5 session, D&D campaign in that world that really helped me flesh out a couple key characters. I fleshed out an entire city, and just got some things in the work that really helped me world build even further. So you don't even really have to be done. If you're working with an RPG setting, I would recommend maybe having a little bit more concrete world building if you're writing a book or maybe a movie, just because you want things to stay consistent.
You need the rules established,
right.
And then from there, you can continue to world build within the rules that you have set for yourself.
Right. But with an RPG setting, you can kind of, your player asks you, it's like, what's in this next town? Well, come back to me next week and I will tell you,
Right. When I started with Elicrid, and how I knew that Elicrid was done and ready, quote unquote, it really wasn't done. Elicrid is not finished at this point, and I'm actively running games in Elicrid, but when I started building Elicrid, I had built out the world map, and I knew where my party was, and I knew where the narrative that I was going to be taking them was taking place, and so I built out that area. And I tried my best to not build out every single tiny detail.
Right.
But I built out the area that they were in, the area that I knew that they were going to interact with next, and then for the rest of it, I just kind of had maybe some bullet points for different locations in different areas, and it was well, maybe they'll go there, maybe they won't, I don't know, but at least I have some vague ideas,
yeah.
And then when, interest is actually shown, oh, we want to go to this place, it's alright, cool, now I can build that, and it doesn't have to. You don't have to go so far as to build out the entire world, especially in an RPG setting.
No.
Before you're able to play in it.
Because you'll never play. Because then you'll never play in your world. It'll just be only world building, which is still fun and great. But if what you want to accomplish with it is to play within that world, eventually you have to just say, you know what, this is good for now. And then see what your players want to do. And
build with your players. Some of the best world building that's come out of Elicrid is me sitting down with players and saying, okay, so your backstory, let's talk about your backstory. Where did you come from? He's like, well, let me see the world map. And then they pick out a country that maybe I have some bullet points on, or maybe I've expounded upon greatly, and all of a sudden, after this brief conversation with a player, I have so many more ideas on how to build out this place just because of that conversation.
And I think that's another point that for the how do you begin? Maybe work together with someone.
Collaboration is great.
It helps a lot when you're bouncing ideas off of each other and you figure out what works and what doesn't work. especially if it's, maybe a potential, someone who likes the same genre of book that you're writing for. Maybe it's one of your players for your RPG setting. Finding someone that you can bounce ideas off of can just increase your world building skills exponentially.
Mm-hmm. What a day.
We covered a lot. So
much.
Here are just a couple of the questions that we went over to help you start with your basics of world building.
The what's?
What is the name of your world? What does your world look like? What is known about your world? And what really defines your world?
When?
When does this occur? Is it existed for a long time? How long has recorded history been around? These questions can really help you develop your timeline.
The who's?
Who populates your world? What is important? What isn't important?
How?
How do you start? And the easiest way to start that is just find a friend, pick your interests, and start.
Just dive headlong into it. Just nosedive, swan dive, do it with some sauce.
Get a notebook, get some pencils, and just be free.
Be free, my friends. And oh my god, notebooks and pencils. Just fill so many of them.
Yes.
But it is completely and utterly up to you with how you start and how you go about it. Every world is different. Every world is unique. It is just a matter of how you make your own setting unique.
And it's also up to you when you decide you can stop. There is no such thing as a finished world. So every world is technically unfinished, and not everything needs to be known about it. And that's great.
And that's perfectly okay. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let us know in the comments below something you enjoyed about today's video, or answer us the question, your favorite thing that defines a specific world.
If you enjoyed today's video, please make sure to hit all those buttons that everyone else bugs you about. We would love for you to join our lunch table.
And stay tuned for our newest video coming out very soon.
Alrighty, lunch buddies. I'm Kat.
I'm Arden13. I'm still waiting on that ramen.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.